This is Jenna Burt, host of the Confessions of a Military Spouse podcast. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. This is Kim Meyer, the host of Choose to Rise here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Choose to Rise, where we talk about living with positive mindsets, how to increase our confidence, building our faith, and living out our life on purpose. A new show comes out via podcast every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if you want to catch the episode live instead, stop by Public House Media around 6:45 Central Standard Time, Monday, Wednesday, Friday as well. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you'll never miss an episode of Choose to Rise. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Today's verse of the day comes from Mark 7:9. And he said to them, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own tradition." Good morning. Welcome to Verse of the Day presented by Public House Media. I'm your host, Baxter Colburn. I'm really grateful that you decided to listen to this episode today because we have a really great guest that I feel like we all are going to take some really big things away from. You've heard the name on the show before, but now we actually have the opportunity to hear him speak. I'm talking about Brian Pursley. You've heard it. His wife, Brooklyn, has been on the show a couple of times previously, and now Brian, who is a pastor at Lakeside Community Church in Algoma, Wisconsin, is going to be joining us in just a moment. I do want to take a minute to say hello to everyone that is listening in Budapest, Hungary on Mana FM. I really am so grateful that you are listening to this show wherever you might be, and I want to say a special thanks to Mana World Vision as well for making everything possible. So with all that being said, let's dive into today's verse. Here's Brian.
The most religious people of the day approached Jesus and they were upset. They couldn't believe what they had just seen. Jesus' disciples, his friends, those who spent the most time with him, had just eaten. But they'd eaten without washing their hands. Not only is this gross, but it flew in the face of tradition. It flew in the face of cultural norms. It flew in the face of what everybody else would do. And there were the Pharisees, the most religious people of the day, who saw this, and indignantly they approached Jesus and they asked him, why do your friends, why do your followers, why don't they do what everyone else does? Why don't your disciples wash their hands according to the tradition and the societal norms that we all follow? And Jesus answered, quoting the prophet Isaiah, and then he said in Mark 7:9 this, Jesus said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition." See, for the Pharisees, it wasn't an issue of hygiene. It wasn't an issue of the disciples being disgusting by not washing their hands, which again, we can all say, yeah, you probably should wash your hands before you eat. But for the Pharisees, this was an outward picture of the way that they felt, that they were actually clean. And it wasn't just that they would wash their hands. They would wash their hands and let the water drip all the way down their arms, symbolically demonstrating to everyone that they were clean. It was an outward appearance. It was an outward show. And what Jesus is saying is, when he says, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition, is he's saying God doesn't care about your traditions. This is always the danger with so much of what happens spiritually in the realm that is seen, because what really matters so often in terms of spirituality happens in a realm that can't be seen. And this is the danger with legalism. Because legalism says, instead of looking to God for the standard, I will play the role of God and I will choose what the standard actually is. And we replace the things of God with the things of our own convictions. And the problem is, the convictions that I have won't necessarily be your convictions in a number of areas, and they don't need to be. And your convictions don't need to be my convictions. But as soon as we set our personal convictions as the standard, we lose sight of what really matters. We lose sight of what's important. And we put ourselves in the role of God to be the judge of what's really important. Much of legalism starts from a good place. It starts with a desire to do the right thing. It starts with a desire to please God and to make sure that the areas of our lives bring honor and glory to God. But the problem is, along the way, things creep in. And we replace the rules and the standards and the mandates of God with the rules and standards and mandates of ourselves. And that's not something that Jesus accepted. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. And so the question I want to leave you with today is very simply this: are you aiming for the commands of God? Or instead, are you aiming for your own tradition? And when you encounter others who do things differently than you do you recognize that their convictions are just as valid as yours, even if they're different than yours? Remember, man looks at the outward appearance. Man looks at what we can see. But God, He looks at something different entirely. God looks at the heart. And ultimately, in the spiritual realm, that's what matters. It's the heart. So make sure that your heart is focused on Jesus and the commands of God. And you allow for the fact that people who love Jesus just as much as you do can make different choices about things you feel very passionately about. And that doesn't mean that they don't love Jesus or that they're doing something wrong. Reject legalism. Reject judging people based on the things that you think everyone else should do. And understand there is diversity amongst those of us who follow Jesus. And that's the way that God designed it to be. That we aren't going to see every issue the exact same way. And that's okay. So make sure that you reject legalism, you reject holding people to your standard, and instead make sure that your heart is focused on the things of God. And make sure you're living a life to honor and glorify God, and not worry about what everyone else thinks. Because not everyone's going to agree with every choice that you make. And as soon as you are constantly concerned about what everybody else thinks instead of ultimately what God thinks, you will find yourself trapped in a vicious cycle in which you can never find freedom. Worry about God and honoring Him. Encourage each other, support each other, and love one another as we focus on the commands of God instead of the traditions of man. I'm Brian Pursley from Lakeside Community Church in Algoma. Thanks so much for listening. If I can help you in any way in your spiritual journey, send me an email. It's brian@lakeside-church.com. That's Brian with an I at lakeside-church.com. And if you enjoyed listening to this verse of the day, check out our podcast, available on the iTunes podcast store under Lakeside Community Church. Thanks so much for listening. God bless you.